Hello, it's Dr. Cindy with this week's Mental Health Moment. We've been looking at common ways of coping that develop during childhood and how these can predispose us to interact with and react to people and situations in our adult lives in those programmed patterns. Today, I'm going to talk about some strategies for trying to expand beyond these habitual ways of responding that served us as children but limit us as adults. Last week, I described a number of these, including achieving, which entails putting energy into success and accomplishment as a means of gaining approval and self esteem, assisting, which involves focusing on others' needs and seeking emotional security by being helpful, and amusing by providing comic relief as a means of keeping the peace and achieving positive responses from others. Additionally, I talked about the strategy of becoming absent, staying under the radar and not drawing attention to oneself as a means of feeling safe, as well as the role of the agitator who expresses emotions verbally and behaviorally in ways that are often experienced as problematic and destructive by others. I'm going to talk briefly about a few other coping strategies that people often develop. These are accommodating, avoiding, and arbitrating. People who are accommodating tend to take on a very passive style of interacting with and relating to others. Outwardly, they are very agreeable and flexible, willing to go along with what other people are wanting and rarely asserting or advocating for their own wants or wishes. Inwardly, they often feel taken advantage of or discounted, resenting that their feelings never seem to matter. They experience others as being selfish or inconsiderate because their feelings don't get considered, not recognizing that their feelings really can't be considered if others don't know what they are, and not realizing that they themselves are not considering their own feelings. They have the expectation that everyone else should be as considerate of and sensitive to their wants and wishes as they are toward everyone else's, and feel hurt and upset when that doesn't occur. Their orientation is so focused on complying with others' requests of them that it doesn't occur to them that they could say no or could propose alternatives. And because they experience requests from others as demands that they must meet, they often feel angry toward the people who are making the request. They reluctantly consent to what others are wanting as a way to keep the peace and avoid conflict. Unfortunately, they end up feeling a great deal of internal conflict by virtue of not standing up for themselves. Avoiding is another common coping strategy that adults use in their interpersonal relationships. In the face of conflict, they may shut down completely and not engage in conversation about the disagreement. Or they might rush to agree with the other person or apologize to them as a way of trying to ease the tension and restore peace. They are often quick to act like nothing happened when a conflict is over, which can be particularly infuriating to the other person if they are still feeling angry and hurt. When they themselves are feeling upset about something, they will often choose not to address this with the other person, as the possibility of it causing discord between them feels too aversive. This also gets stored up as resentment, and over time, those unresolved grievances can actually erode the relationship that they are trying so hard to preserve. Arbitrating involves trying to intervene and smooth things over to reestablish peace when conflicts arise between other people. This person's discomfort with disagreement and tension causes them to run interference between the parties that are not getting along, and they will work to try to reason with them, calm them down, and hopefully bring about resolution to whatever the dispute is about. A child might take on this role when the parents are arguing. A parent may step in as a buffer between the other parent and one of their children during conflict. This might also happen in a work discussion if the conversation becomes too heated. In fact, office dynamics are often a forum in which you can see other people's old coping strategies getting played out. I want to point out that these various roles and strategies are not mutually exclusive. Each person may adopt one or more of these or lean toward certain aspects of these responses in some types of situations while taking on other styles in others. One example of this would be a child who is very helpful and attentive and doting on an alcoholic parent when that parent is sober, but then hides and avoids that parent when she or he is intoxicated. Another example would be an adult who is generally very accommodating with their spouse, but becomes an arbiter when conflict arises between the spouse and one of their children. We all have preferred ways of reacting and interacting based on our early experiences, but we do have the capacity to respond differently. It may feel odd or uncomfortable at first, just as it does when we try to do something with our non dominant hand. Expect that and do not allow it to deter you. As we delve into looking at how to start shifting or expanding habitual ways of interacting with others, I also want to emphasize that none of these is a bad way of being, and every single one has value. Being helpful or achieving are both certainly positive and important qualities for a person to have. Same with having a sense of humor. Being flexible and accommodating clearly are beneficial to positive relationships. Knowing how to de escalate conflicts is a valuable skill, as is being able to stay silent and not engage in conflict sometimes. Conversely, being able to express one's emotions is also an important attribute. So it is not these strategies themselves that are problematic, but the extremes of them. All of these characteristics in moderation are adaptive, but an over reliance on one means we are not truly responding to what is happening in each moment, but are reacting in a habitual and patterned way that limits us in truly expressing ourselves and experiencing the actual interaction we are in the moment. And as long as we feel like we have to act a certain way in order to feel loved or emotionally safe, we don't get to experience being loved even if we deviate from that or learn that we are safe even when there is conflict. Additionally, because these are strategies that we developed when we were little in response to feeling small, scared, vulnerable, and confused, then deep down it really doesn't feel good when we find ourselves reacting from that place as adults. No grown woman wants to feel like a little girl being criticized by a teacher when she's in a meeting with her boss at work. And no man wants to feel like a little boy being scolded by his mom when he's having a disagreement with his wife. So if you went to the gym and you just lifted weights with one of your arms, that arm would become quite strong and muscular, but the rest of your body would be weak by comparison. Or if you only worked on, say, your right arm and right leg, that side of your body would get strong, but you would be out of balance. The same is true for our coping strategies and styles of interacting. The ones we took on as children are overly developed, and we end up relying on these because they're the strongest. But the others need to be developed as well so we are more well rounded, balanced, and integrated in how we approach situations in our lives. So, how do we start to expand out of these old patterns of reacting and relating? Hopefully, you had the opportunity last week to reflect on recent interactions you've had with others to get a sense of what your typical styles of relating are. If you're not sure, think about what comes naturally to you when situations arise with other people. That is probably most in line with the pattern you developed as a child. If you notice different tendencies depending on who the other person is, that's important information as well. What do you find yourself saying and doing in conversations and interactions? Are there things that after the fact you find you wish you had said or done instead? That might give you information about what's more in line with what feels right for you deep down below that initial reflexive response. You might want to write down an alternative script for how you wish the conversations had gone, focusing on what you might have said or done differently. Spend some time examining how it feels to imagine yourself responding in that other way. If it makes you feel nervous or uncomfortable, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good approach for you to work on. In fact, it may mean that's exactly where you should focus your energy. Remember, what comes naturally may not be what's in your best interests. And thinking about doing things differently can stir up some anxiety because it feels like you would be going against what kept you safe. Use this exercise as a way of trying different responses on for size. If you're finding it difficult to come up with an alternative narrative, think of someone you know who seems to have a healthy approach to responding to challenging situations. Then consider how they might address a scenario like the one you're working on. Since each of the approaches I've described has positive aspects, be open to trying to develop all of them as potentially useful responses to have at your disposal for the situations you find yourself in. You're not going to forsake the tendencies you've developed, only expand your repertoire. And the goal isn't to go to the opposite extreme of whatever your usual way of relating is. If you've been a people pleaser, you're not going to work on displeasing people. You are going to work on pleasing yourself more and expressing your own wants and wishes and putting yourself high on the list of people who you want to be there for. If you're an overachiever, you don't overcome this by trying to fail, but maybe you allow yourself to not have to try to be perfect in everything you do. Perhaps you look at ways to put less of your time, energy, and effort into some of your pursuits, trusting that there's a level of performance that's good enough without taking so much out of you. And maybe you can work on being gentle and compassionate with yourself when you do make mistakes, recognizing that your worth isn't based on what you do and how well you do it. If you've been a peacemaker, you're not going to work on creating conflict, but you could work on being able to tolerate conflict and tension more, assuring yourself that you are safe and secure, even if there is disagreement and discord. And you might decide that there are times when it is in your best interest to say something to others about how you are feeling, even if that could be hard for them to hear. If you've been a fixer in relationships or the one who is always rushing to help, you don't start creating problems yourself, but perhaps you step back from rescuing others or rushing in to clean up the mess and trust that people can handle their own problems and challenges. If your tendency has been to hide, you aren't going to try to draw all of the attention to yourself instead, but how can you allow yourself to be seen and heard rather than always disappearing? And if you've been outspoken and expressive, this does not mean you have to work to completely silence yourself, but it might help you learn to first comfort yourself when challenging emotions arise so that when you bring them to others, you do so in a way that facilitates them being receptive to what you have to say. As you contemplate responding differently to situations and people in your life, it's going to feel strange and uncomfortable, and at times even scary. It's important to try to comfort yourself through the anxiety of this as you work to not react in your habitual way. Witness and acknowledge what the reflex is. I'm really wanting to offer to help right now. I'm feeling like I want to ignore this email. I'd like to tell a joke to break the tension. I want to take over this situation and fix it. Whatever your immediate inclination is, really try to support yourself through not reacting in that way. If your tendency is to help fix or rescue, reassure yourself that the other person is capable of handling the situation. If you're feeling pulled to arbitrate a disagreement between others, you may need to step away from the conversation. If you're feeling insecure at work and have the urge to remind your boss in some way of how capable you are, work to comfort yourself through those feelings of insecurity and remind yourself that you are capable. Addressing the anxiety that arises when you don't respond in your habitual way can help you establish emotional safety for yourself in a new and healthier way. When you know the reflexes that you are trying to move out of but aren't sure what to do instead, it's okay at first to not do anything, just as the starting point for not continuing to respond out of that habitual way. Now, the only exception to this is if your pattern is to avoid or hide, because not doing anything is your strong suit. In that case, try to stay present and give some type of response, no matter how small it might be. If you're really wanting to ignore an email, maybe you start by acknowledging the email, letting the other person know you will get back to them later that day. Or if there's a stressful situation with a friend, you can say, I know we need to talk about this, and then establish a time frame within which to do so. If you don't have to face the full stressor head on right in the moment, but it's important to give some type of timely acknowledgement or response so you're not reinforcing that avoidance strategy. I encourage you to look for opportunities to try new ways of responding on for size. You can do this through that writing exercise I mentioned earlier. You can practice with the people in your life that you feel safest with, beginning with small exchanges that aren't heavily charged emotionally. You can even tell trusted others what it is that you're trying to not do so much anymore and ask them to help you by letting you know if you're falling into that old habit or by being a sounding board for you when you're struggling to not react in that old patterned way. Can you reach out to that person and say, oh, I'm really wanting to take over this situation for my daughter. I'm trying to accept that she needs to make her own decisions. And then maybe that friend can kind of comfort and support you through not falling into your old pattern. The goal, again, is not to change who you are, but to expand your repertoire so you don't feel stuck in your reflexive behaviors. If you broke your leg and the doctor said you needed to keep the cast on for the rest of your life, even though the bone no longer needed that level of protection, that would feel very limiting, confining, and excessive. We keep ourselves confined in the role we cast ourselves in as children that protected us when we were vulnerable but aren't necessary for us now. If we continue to react and respond in the ways that we felt we had to as children, we are just repeating the past rather than interacting with current situations in an authentic and genuine way. And as long as we act from that place of vulnerability, we will continue to feel unsafe. When we work to free ourselves from our habitual reactions by trying out and developing other ways of interacting with others, we can start feeling more confident in ourselves because we are no longer relying on old ways of coping that were based on fear. Then we can more regularly respond to each new situation coming from a place of security rather than perpetually re experiencing life through old confining patterns and beliefs. As children, we were victims of our circumstances. As adults, we can be victors over them. Have a good week. Take care.